I am 77 years old. Last Tuesday evening, I was sitting on the edge of the bed taking off my shoes and socks after a long afternoon in the yard. The house was quiet. Eleanor was already in the living room reading a book she had picked up from the local library. I pulled my left sock down over my heel and found myself staring at my ankle in the dim light of the bedroom lamp. For the first time in almost a decade, the skin looked normal. It was just skin. There was no deep indentation where the elastic band had been. There was no shiny, stretched surface. There was no purplish-red discoloration pooling around the ankle bone. My foot actually looked like a foot, and my leg felt light. I sat there for a long moment holding the sock in my hand and remembering how different this routine used to be. For years, taking off my socks at the end of the day was a quiet moment of dread. I would look at the thick, heavy swelling that swallowed my ankles, and I would tell myself a very specific and terrifying story. I told myself my heart was finally giving out. I am sharing this with you because I wish someone had told me what I am about to tell you. I spent a massive portion of my 60s and 70s living under the silent assumption that my cardiovascular system was failing. Every single time I looked down at my swollen feet after a few hours of sitting or walking, I saw a dying heart. I never said this out loud to Eleanor. I certainly never mentioned it to my children. I just carried the fear around with me. I tucked it away in the back of my mind and tried to ignore it. The body warns before it collects, but sometimes we misinterpret the warning completely. We see a symptom and we assign it the most frightening meaning possible, based on family history and things we have heard in passing. My father was a quiet and proud man who lived his whole life in Ohio. He worked hard, he rarely complained, and he ignored physical discomfort until it was impossible to ignore anymore. I remember watching him in his later years. I remember him coming home from work and sitting in his chair. He would take off his shoes and his ankles would be massive. They looked like tree trunks. He never went to a doctor for it. He just started buying wider shoes. He assumed it was just what happens when a man gets old. He assumed his heart was just getting tired of pumping blood around his body. When he eventually passed away from a cardiac event, my mind created a permanent link. Swollen ankles equal heart failure. That was the equation I carried into my own retirement. When my own ankles started to swell noticeably in my late 60s, I felt a cold chill of inevitability. I thought my time had come. I started modifying my life without even realizing I was doing it. I walked less because my legs felt heavy and tight. I stopped standing at the workbench in the garage for long periods. I spent more time sitting in my leather reading chair, thinking I was resting my heart. I thought I was preserving whatever beats I had left. I went to my doctor for my annual checkups, and I would casually mention the swelling. I expected him to look at me with a grave expression and schedule a surgery. Instead, he would listen to my heart, look at my charts, and tell me my heart was actually remarkably strong for my age. That confused me deeply. If my heart was fine, why was gravity winning? Why was all the fluid in my body pooling in my shoes? My doctor prescribed a mild water pill. He told me it would help flush the excess fluid out of my system. I took the pills. They made me run to the bathroom all morning, and by the evening my ankles were swollen again. The pills were treating the symptom, but they were not explaining the mechanism. They were bailing water out of a sinking boat without looking for the hole in the hull. I felt frustrated and incredibly isolated. I felt like I was deteriorating and no one could explain why. The turning point for me did not happen in a medical clinic. It happened in my own kitchen on a rainy Thursday afternoon. My daughter Rebecca had come over for a visit. She is a clinical nutritionist, and she has a way of looking at the human body as a connected ecosystem rather than a collection of isolated parts. We were having tea at the kitchen table. I had my legs stretched out in front of me and I was rubbing my right calf. It felt tight and uncomfortable. Rebecca asked me what was wrong. I hesitated, but I finally confessed my fear. I told her I thought my heart was failing, and that the water pills were not working. I told her I was exhausted from carrying around the extra weight in my legs. Rebecca put her teacup down and looked at me with a mix of affection and professional intensity. She told me something that completely shifted my understanding of my own body. She said the problem was likely not my heart pushing the blood down. The problem was the return trip. She asked me if I knew that the human body actually has a second heart. I thought she was speaking metaphorically. I thought she meant the soul or something poetic, but she was being entirely literal. She explained that the heart in my chest is a powerful pump, but it only has enough force to push the oxygenated blood down to my toes. It does not have the suction power to pull that heavy blood all the way back up against gravity. I was fascinated. I spent decades working in publishing and educational communication. I appreciate a logical system. I asked her how the blood gets back up if the chest heart cannot pull it. She pointed to my lower legs. She said the calf muscles are the second heart. Every time we take a step, every time we flex our ankles, the calf muscles contract and squeeze the deep veins in our legs. That squeezing action physically pushes the blood upward. To keep the blood from falling back down between steps, those veins are equipped with tiny, delicate one-way valves. As long as we are moving, and as long as those valves are healthy, the system works perfectly against the relentless pull of gravity. But Rebecca did not stop there. She introduced me to the concept that frightened me the most, and ultimately saved my mobility. She explained that the fluid swelling my ankles was not just pure water. I had always imagined it was just hydration that got lost on the way. I was wrong. She explained that when the venous valves become weak from age, from sitting too much, or from chronic hidden inflammation, the blood pools in the lower legs. The pressure inside those veins builds up tremendously. Eventually, the pressure forces the liquid portion of the blood out through the walls of the veins and into the surrounding tissue. That liquid is called interstitial fluid. This was the part that kept me awake that night. That fluid is not clean water. It is metabolic waste. It is the exhaust from cellular activity. It is full of inflammatory byproducts. When that fluid sits stagnant in the tissues of the ankles and calves, it does not just make the legs look big. It creates a low-grade chronic fire of inflammation. It slowly damages the tissue. It degrades the skin, which is why older people with chronic swelling often develop fragile, discolored skin on their lower legs. The body is essentially stewing in its own waste because the garbage disposal system lost its power. After she left, I went into my study. I sat in my leather chair and opened a fresh notebook. I started reading everything I could find about venous insufficiency, the calf muscle pump, and the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is the other half of the drainage equation. It is a network of vessels that clears away waste, but it has no pump at all. Zero. It relies entirely on physical movement and deep diaphragmatic breathing to move fluid. I realized that my lifestyle had become a perfect recipe for stagnation. I was sitting more because I was afraid of my heart. By sitting more, I was shutting down my second heart. I was paralyzing my calf muscles. I was allowing the pressure to build, the valves to stretch, and the inflammatory fluid to leak into my tissues. My fear of heart failure was actually causing the exact mechanical failure I was experiencing. Before I tell you exactly what I changed to reverse this process in my own life, I want to pause for a moment. Many of you who watch these videos regularly and find value in these conversations have not actually subscribed to the channel yet. If you feel that these observations are helpful to you, please take a second to check if you are subscribed. It helps us keep doing this, and it ensures we can keep sharing these discoveries together. Now let me tell you about the corrections I had to make. The first thing I had to accept was that water pills were not going to rebuild my venous valves. They were a temporary tool, not a permanent solution. I needed to address the mechanics. I started with the most obvious correction, which was movement. But I had to learn the difference between just moving and actively engaging the second heart. I realized that the way I was walking around the house was more of a shuffle. I was keeping my feet relatively flat. That kind of walking does not fully engage the calf muscle. I had to consciously retrain myself to walk with a deliberate heel-to-toe strike. I had to feel my calf muscle contract and push off the ground with every single step. It felt exaggerated at first. Daniel, my son, watched me walking across the yard one day and asked why I was marching. I told him I was pumping my second heart. He is a civil engineer, so when I explained the fluid dynamics and the valves, he understood perfectly. He actually told me to keep marching. I also started doing specific intentional calf contractions even when I was not walking. Every morning while I brushed my teeth, I would slowly raise myself up onto my toes and then slowly lower myself back down. I would do this 20 or 30 times. I could feel the burn in the muscle. I visualized that muscle squeezing the deep veins and forcing that stagnant inflammatory fluid up and out of my lower legs. I did the same thing whenever I was standing at the kitchen counter waiting for the kettle to boil. It was not a workout. It was a mechanical maintenance routine for a failing plumbing system. The second major realization involved how I was resting. For years, when my legs felt heavy, I would go to the living room and sit in my recliner. I would pull the lever, the footrest would come up, and I would think I was elevating my legs. I was completely wrong. When you sit in a standard recliner, your feet are elevated relative to the floor, but they are still lower than your hips and significantly lower than your chest. Gravity is still pulling the fluid down. The fluid might drain out of your feet and pool in your thighs or pelvis, but it is not getting back to the core where the kidneys can process it. I learned that true elevation requires the ankles to be physically higher than the level of the heart. I started a new routine in the late afternoons. I would lie flat on the floor in the spare bedroom or sometimes on the sofa if my back was bothering me. I would place 3 firm pillows under my lower legs, making sure my heels were the highest point in the line. I would stay there for 20 minutes. At first, it was incredibly uncomfortable. My legs throbbed. I could almost feel the fluid shifting, draining out of the stretched tissues. But when I stood up after those 20 minutes, my legs felt shockingly light. The heavy dead feeling was gone. I was manually giving my venous system a break from the relentless pressure of gravity. But mechanics were only half the battle. The other half was the chemistry of the swelling. I had to look very closely at what I was putting into my body that was encouraging my tissues to hold on to water in the first place. This is where Eleanor and I had to make some uncomfortable changes in the kitchen. We always thought we ate a relatively healthy diet. We did not eat a lot of fast food. We cooked at home. But when I started reading the labels on the things in our pantry, I was horrified. I discovered the trap of invisible sodium. I am not talking about the salt shaker on the dining table. The salt we sprinkle on our food is a fraction of the problem. The real danger is the industrial sodium hidden in packaged foods. We used to eat a lot of canned soups, especially in the winter. We thought they were a light, healthy meal. One can of our favorite chicken soup had more sodium than I should have been consuming in an entire day. We used bottled salad dressings, packaged bread, and certain deli meats. Sodium acts like a magnet for water. When you consume high amounts of hidden sodium, your body is forced to hold on to excess fluid to dilute the salt in your bloodstream. That excess fluid increases the volume of your blood. More volume means more pressure in the veins. More pressure means more fluid leaking into the ankles. I had to radically reduce my intake of that invisible processed sodium. We stopped buying the canned soups. Eleanor started making large batches of soup from scratch on Sundays, using fresh vegetables and low-sodium broth, freezing portions for the week. We started making our own simple salad dressings with olive oil and lemon juice. The shift in my body was noticeable within a week. I found myself waking up at night to use the bathroom, not because of a water pill, but because my body was finally releasing the fluid it had been hoarding to manage the salt overload. I also had to learn about foods that actively fight the inflammation that damages the delicate valves in the veins. When the interstitial fluid sits in the tissues, it creates oxidative stress. I needed to counteract that. I started incorporating more foods rich in specific compounds that support vascular health. I started eating more dark berries like blueberries and blackberries. I made sure I was eating leafy greens every single day. I started drinking green tea in the morning instead of my usual heavy coffee. I was not looking for a magical cure. I was looking to change the internal environment of my body from one that promoted inflammation to one that supported repair. I made mistakes along the way. The biggest mistake I made early on was a lack of patience. I expected decades of vascular damage to reverse itself in a fortnight. There were weeks when I was doing the calf raises, doing the proper elevation, watching my sodium, and my ankles would still swell slightly by the evening. I would get frustrated. I would think the whole protocol was useless. I wanted to quit and just go back to my reading chair and accept the decline. I told Rebecca about my frustration during one of her visits. She reminded me of something very important. She told me that the skin and the tissue in my lower legs had been stretched and compromised for years. The veins had been under massive pressure for a very long time. The body heals, but it heals on its own schedule. It requires consistency, not intensity. I had to accept that I was managing a chronic vulnerability, not curing a temporary cold. I had to make these new habits permanent fixtures of my life. I could not just do the calf raises until the swelling went down and then stop. If I stopped, the gravity would win again. The fluid would return. The inflammation would restart. I had to view these practices the same way I view brushing my teeth. It is just hygiene. Leg elevation is vascular hygiene. Calf pumps are lymphatic hygiene. Reading labels for hidden sodium is cellular hygiene. Once I stopped looking for a quick finish line and accepted the daily maintenance, the frustration vanished. I settled into the routine. The weeks turned into months. The changes were gradual, but they were profound. The deep, tight swelling became a softer, milder swelling. The purplish discoloration slowly faded back to a normal skin tone. The skin itself stopped looking shiny and fragile and regained its normal texture. But the most significant change was not visual. It was the physical sensation of lightness. The feeling of dragging lead weights around attached to my feet completely disappeared. That brings me back to last Tuesday evening, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding that sock and looking at a normal, healthy ankle. I thought about all the years I wasted sitting in my chair, afraid to move, convinced my heart was dying. I thought about my father, silently accepting his swollen legs as an unavoidable curse of aging. I realized how much of our suffering in our later years comes from a simple lack of understanding about how our own machinery works. We are not just a collection of failing parts. We are a complex, interconnected system. When one part struggles, it is usually because another part is being ignored. My heart was not failing. My heart was doing its job perfectly. It was my second heart that I had neglected. It was my vascular plumbing that was overloaded with invisible salt and stagnant fluid. Once I understood the mechanism, the fear evaporated. Once the fear was gone, I could take action. Aging requires a different kind of attention. The things we could get away with in our 40s become the things that disable us in our 70s. We can no longer afford to be passive passengers in our own bodies. We have to learn how the systems work. We have to be curious about the symptoms instead of just being terrified of them. We have to ask better questions when we go to the doctor. Do not just accept a pill to manage a symptom without demanding to understand the underlying mechanical failure. Yesterday afternoon, I took my 3 grandchildren for a walk through the nature trail behind our neighborhood. We walked for over an hour. The path is uneven, full of roots and slight inclines. 5 years ago, I would never have attempted that walk. I would have been too afraid of the heavy, throbbing pain in my lower legs. I would have made an excuse and stayed on the porch. But yesterday I kept pace with them. I felt the ground under my feet. I felt my calf muscles contracting, pumping the blood back up, doing exactly what they were designed to do. I felt alive, capable, and present. You do not have to accept the heavy, swollen legs as your permanent reality. You do not have to live with the fear that your heart is quietly surrendering if you have not investigated the mechanics of your own vascular system. Look at how you sit. Look at how you walk. Look closely at the hidden chemistry in your pantry. The body has an incredible capacity to repair itself, even in our 70s, if we stop working against it and start providing the maintenance it actually needs. I learned this late in the game, but I learned it in time. Envelhecer bem começa pelo que você para de ignorar. Some damage happens silently until one day it doesn't happen anymore. You do not need fear. You need attention.